last train to the Watchtower. It was the last train to the Watchtower, a line that ran only once each night, threading its way through dense, ancient woods where even the moonlight seemed hesitant to linger. The traveler, a solitary figure clutching a worn leather bag, settled into a cracked leather seat, eyes fixed on the window. Outside, the forest whispered secrets in the rustle of leaves, but inside, the carriage was unnervingly silent, as if the air itself was holding its breath. Minutes passed, marked only by the gentle clatter of wheels on rails. Then came a faint murmur, almost like a voice carried on the wind, barely audible yet unmistakably human. The traveler's gaze darted from the window to the empty aisle, searching for the source. But the carriage remained deserted, save for a faint, cold draft that brushed against the traveler's neck like a whisper of something unseen. The train slowed as it approached the Watchtower station, a forgotten stop swallowed by vines and decay. The traveler stared out, the silhouette of the tower jagged against the night sky, windows dark and hollow like empty eyes. The murmur grew louder, now overlapping with a low, persistent hum that seemed to vibrate in the bones, a sound that felt both distant and unbearably close. Suddenly, the lights flickered, plunging the carriage into near darkness, and in that fleeting shadow, the traveler saw it, a silhouette standing just beyond the window, motionless but unmistakably there. Heart pounding, the traveler blinked, and the figure vanished. The hum ceased. A silence thicker than before settled over the train, pressing in like a living thing, waiting. Then came the scream, not loud, but raw and desperate, echoing faintly through the trees beyond the station. It was a sound pulled straight from a nightmare, fraying the edge of reality. The traveler's breath caught, eyes searching the dark for answers that never came. As the train began to move again, the Watchtower faded behind, but the feeling remained. Something had been watching, waiting just beyond the veil of night. Back inside the carriage, the traveler's hands trembled slightly, yet the window now showed only the quiet woods, as if the night had swallowed the strange encounter whole. But in the silence, the faintest whisper seemed to drift once more, a question without answer, a secret left suspended in the cold air. The last train to the Watchtower was not just a journey through the dark. It was a passage into something far more unsettling, something that lingered long after the rails fell away. The whispers with no exit. Mia's first night in the apartment was marked by an uneasy silence, broken only by the occasional creak of settling wood. It was a modest space in an aging complex nestled in a quiet town, the kind of place where walls seemed to hold onto secrets. As she unpacked, a faint murmur brushed against her ears, a whisper so soft she thought it might be the wind slipping through a cracked window. She paused, heart quickening, but found only the empty room staring back. Over the next few nights, the whispers returned, growing a fraction louder each time. They were not words she could catch, but tones, urgent, pleading, almost musical. Mia found herself lying awake, straining to listen, her mind replaying the faint sounds like an unsolved riddle. The apartment's silence felt less empty, more alive, as if the walls themselves breathed in quiet anticipation. One afternoon, while sorting through old books left behind by the previous tenant, Mia discovered a brittle journal with yellowed pages. The entries spoke of a tenant who had vanished without a trace decades ago, plagued by voices that no one else could hear. The words trembled with fear and isolation, describing a labyrinth of whispers that seemed to close in with every passing day. A shiver ran down Mia's spine as she realized the voices might not be a trick of her imagination. That evening, the whispers shifted tone, no longer distant murmurs, but voices that seemed to echo from inside the walls. Mia pressed her ear against the cold plaster, trying to decipher the fragmented phrases, names, warnings, cries for help. The boundaries between her reality and the voices blurred, filling her with a creeping paranoia. Was she being pulled into a forgotten story, or was the apartment itself alive with something restless? Mia began to notice subtle changes. Objects slightly moved, shadows lingering just beyond sight, and a cold draft that followed her from room to room. Each night, the whispers grew more insistent, weaving together into words she could almost understand, but never fully grasp. Sleep became a fragile state between worlds, where she felt watched and pursued by unseen eyes. Her reflection in the mirror sometimes flickered, vanishing for a heartbeat before returning, leaving her questioning her own existence. Driven by a mix of fear and curiosity, Mia traced the apartment's history through old town records and neighbors' hushed stories. She learned of a tragic event, a tenant who had vanished after claiming the walls whispered secrets only she could hear. The apartment had changed hands many times since, but each occupant left sooner than expected. The whispers, it seemed, had no end, no exit, and they clung to the place like a shadow no light could cast away. One night, as the whispers crescendoed into a near chant, Mia felt herself pulled toward the narrow hallway where the voices were loudest. The walls seemed to breathe, closing in and expanding with a rhythm that matched her quickening pulse. She reached out a trembling hand, touching the cracked plaster, and for a moment, the voices ceased, replaced by an overwhelming silence that screamed louder than any sound. When the whispers returned, they carried a new urgency, as if warning her that some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. In the days that followed, Mia found herself trapped in a limbo of reality and shadow, where the whispers never ceased and the apartment's silence was forever broken. She could no longer tell if the voices were memories, warnings, or something more sinister, a presence that refused to let go. And as she stared into the peeling walls, she understood the terrifying truth. Some whispers have no end, and some stories are meant to linger in the dark, with no exit in sight. Buried under Black Hollow, and the screaming started. Claire had always thought inheriting the cabin near Black Hollow would be a quiet reprieve from the city's endless noise. Nestled deep within the thick woods, the cabin's weathered timbers and cracked windows told stories of long-forgotten days. The first evening settled in with an uneasy stillness, the kind that presses on your chest and makes ordinary sounds feel like whispers of secrets. As she unpacked the last box, a faint, distant sound broke the silence, a piercing scream, sharp and brief, swallowed almost immediately by the dense night. She told herself it was just an animal, or perhaps the wind playing tricks among the trees. The next days carried a mounting unease as the screams returned, always in the dead hours when the forest seemed to breathe with a life of its own. Claire ventured outside during the daylight, hoping to chase away the shadows with sunlight. But the woods around Black Hollow felt unnatural trees bent in odd angles, roots tangled like grasping hands, and patches of earth seemed freshly disturbed, as if something had been hiding just beneath the surface. At night, sleep was elusive. The darkness pressed against the windows, and every creak or crack felt like a warning. One evening, driven by a restless impulse, Claire found an old, rusted shovel buried beneath a pile of dead leaves near the cabin's porch. It seemed out of place, almost deliberately hidden. She hesitated, then began to dig where the soil felt soft. Hours passed, and the soil gave way to a rough wooden box, its lid slightly ajar. Heart pounding, she peered inside, but the dim moonlight revealed only darkness. Then faint whispers seemed to rise from the hollow, voices indistinct, but filled with sorrow and warning. The air thickened, and the silence shattered with a scream that was no longer distant. It was right beneath her feet. From that night, the boundary between waking and dreaming blurred. The screams echoed inside her mind, and shadows flickered in the corner of her vision. She sometimes caught glimpses of figures lurking just beyond the tree line, too vague to be certain, yet too persistent to ignore. The woods seemed to breathe, exhaling cold gusts that whispered her name. Claire's reflection in the cabin window twisted oddly, showing a pale face that wasn't quite hers. The cabin, once a sanctuary, had become an echo chamber for voices buried long ago, their secrets clawing through the soil and her sanity alike. On the final night, unable to endure the haunting any longer, Claire stepped into the forest, drawn by the screams that now felt like a tortured call she couldn't resist. The trees closed in, their twisted limbs forming a suffocating canopy. The earth beneath her feet seemed to pulse, and the whispers grew into a chorus of mournful cries. She reached the hollow, a dark depression in the ground, its edges crumbling and overgrown. As she peered in, the screams crescendoed, and the ground shifted, revealing tangled roots wrapped around unidentifiable shapes. The hollow was not just a place, but a threshold to buried memories and forgotten pain. Claire felt herself slipping, swallowed by the darkness, and the voices forever trapped beneath Black Hollow. The fog that watches back. Emma's first night in the coastal town was swallowed by fog so thick it felt like stepping into a cloud. The streetlights cast hazy halos, and every familiar sound was muffled and distorted. At first, she thought the fog was just weather, an atmospheric quirk of this isolated place. But as she peered from her window, she felt an unsettling weight in the air, as if the mist itself was conscious, waiting. Something felt wrong, something unseen lurking just beyond the veil of gray. Days passed, and the fog never lifted. Emma noticed it creeping closer to her house each evening, curling around the porch and pressing against the windows like cold, wet fingers. Shadows seemed to move within it, shapes that vanished when she blinked or looked away. At night, faint whispers teased the edges of her hearing, indecipherable but persistent. Sleep became restless, filled with dreams of being watched, followed by something neither human nor animal. Attempting to explain the growing dread, Emma visited the local library, where she found a brittle journal tucked between dusty shelves. Its pages spoke of an ancient phenomenon. The fog was said to be a guardian of secrets, a watcher of sins long buried beneath the town's soil. It didn't just blanket the streets, it observed, remembered, and sometimes demanded acknowledgement. The townsfolk called it the watching mist, a presence best left undisturbed. That night, the fog pressed harder against her windows, and Emma saw a faint shape form just beyond the glass, a blurred face, eyes glinting with an unnatural intelligence. She blinked, and it was gone. The whispers rose, now almost voices, urging her to look deeper, to remember. Fear tangled with fascination, as Emma realized the fog wasn't a mere weather pattern. It was a sentient force, entwined with the town's history and her own past in ways she couldn't yet grasp. Compelled beyond reason, Emma ventured into the thickest parts of the fog during the early morning hours. The world around her dissolved into gray silence, and the mist whispered secrets she could almost understand, names, places, feelings long buried. The fog revealed glimpses of old memories, not hers, but intertwined with her family's hidden past. The line between watcher and watched blurred, and Emma felt herself being drawn into the fog's cold embrace, a price for unveiling what was meant to stay forgotten. Days later, the fog finally began to thin. The town seemed lighter, quieter, but Emma knew the mist still lingered, watching from just beyond sight. And sometimes, when the wind shifted and the night grew still, she felt the fog's gaze upon her, patient and unyielding. It was no longer just a weather phenomenon. It had become a presence woven into her life, an enigmatic watcher that never truly lets go. The curse of Deadwood, and the clock stopped. Deadwood was a town forgotten by time, nestled deep in the folds of a dense forest where the sun seemed reluctant to linger. At its heart stood a grand clock tower, its hands forever frozen at midnight. Locals whispered of a curse, but few dared speak openly. When Eliza, a writer drawn by stories of the supernatural, arrived on a chill autumn evening, she felt an unsettling stillness, like the town was holding its breath. The clock tower's silent face loomed over her, casting a shadow longer than night itself. Liza's first night in Deadwood was restless. The silence was broken only by the soft creaking of old wood and a faint ticking, though the clock had not moved in decades. As she explored, she noticed how every house seemed abandoned, windows dark and eyes watching from within. The air grew colder, heavier, as if unseen eyes followed her every step. She tried to shake off the feeling, attributing it to isolation, but the sensation of being trapped in a moment that refused to pass gnawed at her. The next day, Eliza found an old journal in the town's barely preserved library. Its pages chronicled the clock tower's history, the day it stopped, and the tragic disappearance of the town's bell ringer, a man named Thomas. The townsfolk believed Thomas had been cursed after meddling with the clock's mechanism, condemning Deadwood to eternal midnight. Eliza's fingers trembled as she read the last entry. When the clock stops, time dies, and those trapped within are lost forever. As night fell again, Eliza heard distant chimes, soft, irregular, and haunting. They did not come from the clock tower, but somewhere deeper within the town. Compelled by an unseen force, she followed the sound into the woods encircling Deadwood. The trees whispered secrets in the wind, and shadows stretched to grasp at her ankles. The chimes grew louder until she reached a small clearing where an ancient, broken pocket watch lay half buried beneath dead leaves. Its hands also stopped at 12. Liza's mind began to twist with the feeling that time was unraveling around her. Each tick she heard was out of sync. Each shadow cast by the moon seemed to move independently. She realized that Deadwood was not just frozen in time. The town was caught between moments, a limbo where the past bled into the present. The clock had stopped, but the curse kept the nightmare alive. Desperately, she tried to leave, but the paths twisted back on themselves, and the shadows whispered her name, refusing to let her go. In the depths of the night, Eliza stood once more before the clock tower. She dared to touch the frozen hands, feeling a coldness seep into her bones. Suddenly, the clock shuddered, its hands twitching, but never moving forward. The bell inside groaned, but did not ring. A voice, barely a whisper, echoed, "Time is not meant to move here." Eliza understood then that Deadwood was a prison of moments, and she was now part of its endless midnight, destined to wander between the ticks of a clock that would never strike again. The sun never rose in Deadwood again. Visitors who came searching found only silence and a clock frozen forever. And sometimes, when the wind is just right, they say you can hear a soft ticking beneath the stillness, an eternal reminder that some places are caught in time's cruel grasp, where the past and present are forever entwined, and the curse of Deadwood endures in the shadows of a stopped clock. The Whispering Walls. Emma's first night in the old cottage was quieter than she expected, but as the hours deepened, so did the silence, thick and almost suffocating. Just as she drifted toward sleep, a faint murmur began to thread through the stillness. At first, it was no more than a breath, like wind sighing through cracked window panes. But beneath that, there was a rhythm, a cadence almost like whispered words, too soft to grasp, but insistent enough to stir her curiosity and unease. By the third evening, Emma found herself drawn to the source, the walls themselves. She pressed her ear against the peeling wallpaper, and the murmurs sharpened, as if the house was breathing secrets just beyond the edge of hearing. Names, fragments of conversations, and half-forgotten fears seemed to seep through the plaster. Each whisper tugged at her mind, an invitation or a warning she couldn't yet decipher, leaving her heart pounding in a mixture of dread and fascination. Sleep became a stranger as the voices grew bolder. They no longer whispered just names or fragments. Now they recited stories, tales of loss, betrayal, and sorrow tangled in the house's history. Emma scribbled notes in her journal, each word a thread she hoped would unravel the mystery. Yet, the more she learned, the more the line between past and present blurred. Shadows seemed to watch her from the corners of rooms, and she couldn't tell if the voices were warnings or pleas for help. One night, the whispering stopped, an eerie silence heavier than before. Then, a single, clear voice broke the quiet, calling Emma's name from the wall beside her bed. It was neither threatening nor kind, but edged with urgent desperation. Frozen, Emma reached out and touched the plaster. The wall felt warm beneath her fingertips, pulsing faintly like a heartbeat. In that moment, she understood. The house was alive in a way she hadn't imagined, and its story was far from finished. The following days melded into restless wakefulness. Emma found herself speaking aloud to the walls, asking questions she barely dared to voice. The responses came in riddles, half-truths wrapped in shadows, revealing a tragedy buried beneath layers of time and silence. Whether these whispers were remnants of trapped souls or echoes of Emma's own unraveling mind, she could no longer tell. The house had become a mirror reflecting fears, memories, and the fragile boundary between sanity and madness. On the last night before she planned to leave, Emma uncovered a hidden compartment behind the living room paneling. Inside lay a worn photograph and a letter, yellowed with age. The letter told of a woman who once lived there, whose isolation had twisted into despair, her voice forever trapped inside the walls, reaching out for someone to remember her. As Emma held the letter, the whispers softened, turning almost mournful, as if the house was finally ready to rest. But as dawn broke, the echo of a faint, lingering voice whispered not goodbye, but a promise to wait. The mirror in Ash Hollow. Ash Hollow was the kind of town that slipped quietly beneath maps and memories. Mara arrived with a suitcase full of silence, hoping the slow pace and cracked sidewalks might dull the sharp edges of her grief. At the weekly market, an old man with eyes like faded storm clouds offered her a mirror. Not just any mirror, one with an intricate wooden frame, worn by decades, its glass slightly rippled, as if holding a secret beneath its surface. She hesitated, then bought it, drawn by an inexplicable pull, as if the mirror whispered promises of something she could not yet name. Back in her creaking attic room, Mara placed the mirror against the wall where shadows lengthened with the setting sun. At first, it was just a reflection, her own tired eyes, the peeling wallpaper, the faint outline of the moon through the curtained window. But as days passed, the mirror seemed to deepen, its surface rippling like a dark pond. One night, Mara caught a flicker, a shadow that didn't belong to her, a movement just beyond the glass. Was it a trick of the light or something watching from within? She told herself it was exhaustion, the mind's way of weaving stories in the dark. Sleep became fragmented. Each night, Mara dreamed of Ash Hollow's forgotten faces, their eyes empty yet pleading. The mirror grew colder to the touch, and when she looked closely, fleeting images appeared, a hand pressed against the glass from the inside, a whisper of breath fogging its surface. She tried to cover it, to hide it in the deep. The clock that stopped at the lake, Sarah had always been drawn to places forgotten by time, so when she inherited her grandmother's cabin by the lake, it felt like destiny. The locals warned her with hushed voices, "Don't stay after sunset at the lake. It changes then." But the loneliness of the city pressed on her, and the promise of quiet nights beneath the stars was too tempting to resist. On her first evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, an unusual stillness settled over the water, a silence so deep it seemed to swallow the world whole. Inside the cabin, an old clock ticked rhythmically, its pendulum slicing the silence with a steady rhythm. Sarah found comfort in its presence, something tangible in a place that felt otherwise untethered. But as midnight approached, the clock's ticking slowed, then ceased altogether. The sudden silence was startling, as if the very heartbeat of the cabin had stopped. Sarah glanced at the clock face, its hands frozen exactly at 12. Outside, the mist thickened, curling like fingers across the water and creeping toward the shore. Curiosity gnawed at Sarah, despite the unease rising in her chest. She stepped outside, the cool night air thick with moisture and the scent of damp earth. The lake's surface, once a mirror to the stars, was now a churning veil of fog that seemed to hum with whispered voices just beyond comprehension. Shapes flickered in the corner of her vision, shadowy figures that vanished whenever she turned to face them. The world felt untethered from time. The stars overhead blinked uncertainly, and the distant hoot of an owl sounded hollow and wrong. Trying to calm herself, Sarah returned to the cabin, but the door, which she had locked moments before, now stood slightly ajar. Inside, the air was colder, the silence heavier. On the table lay an old photograph, one she didn't remember seeing before, showing a group of people by the lake, their faces blurred, distorted, almost melting into the background. At the bottom, scrawled in faded ink, were the words, "We stayed too long." Fear prickled at her skin as the clock chimed once, a sound deep and hollow, though its hands remained still. Sarah's phone buzzed suddenly, shattering the silence. A message appeared, "Don't look at the lake after midnight." The sender was unknown. Heart pounding, she glanced outside once more. The mist now formed a thick wall, pulsating as if alive. Shapes emerged, faces pressed against the fog, eyes hollow and pleading. She realized then the lake wasn't just water and mist. It was a boundary, a veil between worlds. And once the clock stopped, time itself stalled, trapping those who lingered in a limbo never meant for the living. With trembling hands, Sarah packed a bag, desperate to leave before the clock struck midnight again. But as she reached the door, the wind carried a whisper, "Stay with us." The mist seeped inside, curling around her ankles like cold fingers. The clock chimed once more, and Sarah's vision blurred, time fractured, moments repeating in an endless loop. Outside, the lake remained still, reflecting a sky frozen in midnight blue, waiting patiently for its next visitor, one who might never leave. The mirror that sees everything. Emma never believed in the supernatural until the day she inherited her grandmother's old house and its most curious possession, an antique mirror framed in dark oak, carved with swirling patterns that almost seemed alive. The mirror stood in the corner of the dimly lit bedroom, its glass unnervingly clear, almost too perfect. At first, Emma thought it was just a beautiful relic, but it didn't take long before she noticed something strange. Her reflection occasionally lagged behind her movements, or caught glimpses of things she didn't see in the room. One evening, as twilight bled into dusk, Emma sat before the mirror brushing her hair. Suddenly, the reflection showed not just her room, but the faint outline of a figure standing motionless behind her, though when she turned, no one was there. Heart pounding, she looked back into the glass, and the figure vanished, leaving only her own trembling reflection. The mirror seemed to capture more than light. It held a memory, or perhaps a secret. The house, once familiar and safe, was now whispered with shadows she couldn't explain. Days passed, and the mirror's unsettling visions grew more vivid. Emma saw flashes of past moments: her grandmother sitting quietly in the same chair, eyes fixed on the mirror, lips moving as if whispering secrets. Sometimes the glass rippled like water, and distant sounds, soft murmurs, footsteps, echoed faintly. Emma's dreams blurred with waking, making her question what was real. The mirror was no longer a window to her reflection, but a portal to something lurking beneath the surface of her reality. One restless night, drawn by a whisper that seemed to seep from the glass itself, Emma touched the mirror's surface. The coldness shocked her, but then the glass rippled like a dark liquid, pulling her gaze deeper. Inside, she saw a shadowed version of the room, distorted and empty, except for a small, locked wooden box resting where her grandmother's chair had been. The box seemed to pulse with a quiet energy, and Emma felt an overwhelming compulsion to find it in her own world, as if the mirror was guiding her toward a hidden truth. Frantically searching the house the next day, Emma found the box hidden beneath floorboards beneath the mirror's corner. The lock was old but fragile, and inside she discovered a bundle of faded letters and a delicate silver locket inscribed with strange symbols. The letters spoke of a pact made long ago, a promise to keep a secret trapped within the mirror's depths. As Emma read, the mirror darkened, and the room seemed to close in. The boundary between reflection and reality blurred, leaving her wondering if she'd ever truly escape the gaze of the mirror that sees everything. That night, as the house settled into silence, Emma stared into the mirror one last time. Her reflection smiled back, yet behind her in the glass, a shadowy figure lingered, watching. No matter how she moved, the figure remained, a silent guardian or a prisoner of the glass. Emma realized the mirror's secret was not a curse to break, but a truth to live with. Some reflections never fade, and some eyes never close. The forgotten basement, and it called my name. When I first moved into the house, the basement was the last thing on my mind. The realtor had mentioned it briefly, calling it just storage, but the heavy wooden door at the bottom of the hallway always seemed to lurk in my peripheral vision. It was locked tight, the key long lost, or so I thought. For weeks, I avoided it, focusing instead on unpacking boxes and settling into my new life. Then, late one night, I woke to a faint whisper, soft, almost like my name carried on a breath of wind from somewhere below. I told myself it was just the old house settling, but the feeling of being watched refused to leave. The following nights, the whispering grew more persistent, sometimes barely audible, other times almost clear. It wasn't just my name. It was like the basement itself was calling to me, coaxing me closer with a voice that was both familiar and alien. I started to notice small changes around the door, faint scratches on the wood, as if something was trying to get out or in. Sleep became a distant memory as my dreams filled with dark staircases and shadowy figures waiting just beyond sight. Yet a pull deeper than fear urged me to find the key, to open the door and face whatever was down there. I found the key hidden inside an old book on the dusty shelf upstairs, an unremarkable object that suddenly felt heavy in my hand. As I approached the basement, the air grew colder, thicker, like the house was holding its breath. The lock clicked open with surprising ease, and the door creaked wide, revealing a narrow staircase swallowed by darkness. I hesitated, heart pounding, but the voice whispered again, soft, desperate, and unmistakably mine. Taking a deep breath, I stepped inside, each footstep swallowed by the oppressive quiet. The basement held no furniture, no boxes, only a thick, impenetrable shadow that seemed to pulse with life. As I descended, the whispers transformed into fragmented sentences, half-remembered memories, names I hadn't spoken aloud in years, and a chilling familiarity that I couldn't place. Something was in the basement with me, but it wasn't a ghost or a stranger. It was a part of myself, buried deep and forgotten, calling me home. The shadows shifted, forming vague shapes that seemed to watch, waiting. I reached the bottom step and froze. The temperature dropped, breath turning to mist. For a moment, I thought I saw my own reflection in the blackness, eyes wide, searching, trapped. I wanted to run, but a strange calm settled over me, as if the basement was not a place to fear, but to remember. I turned to leave, but the door slammed shut above me without a sound. The whispers rose into a quiet chorus, a lullaby of forgotten truths and hidden fears. In the suffocating darkness, I realized the basement wasn't just beneath the house, it was beneath me, inside me. Something had waited patiently for me to remember, to acknowledge what I had locked away long ago. As I stood alone, the voice called my name one last time, soft, inviting, and impossibly close. And then, silence. The door creaked open slowly, and I stepped back into the light, forever changed by what I had found in the forgotten basement. Last train to Crimson Hill, and the eyes appeared. The clock at the station blinked 11:45 p.m. as Michael stepped onto the creaking platform. The last train to Crimson Hill waiting like a dark leviathan. Rain hammered down relentlessly, soaking his coat and chilling his bones. The platform was deserted, save for a flickering lamp casting weak light over gleaming rails that disappeared into a black tunnel of trees. Boarding the train felt like crossing an invisible threshold where the mundane world slipped away, and something unknown stirred in the shadows beyond. The train's wheels groaned as it pulled away from the station, plunging into night's embrace. Michael sank into a worn leather seat, the carriage lit by flickering overhead bulbs that buzzed softly. Outside, the trees blurred into a dark smear, but every so often, something caught his eye, faint, unblinking points of light deep in the woods. He blinked and looked again, but the eyes vanished like a trick of the rain. A cold unease crept up his spine, the silence inside the carriage growing heavier with each mile. As the train wound deeper into the forest, the eyes multiplied dozens, then hundreds, glowing with an unnatural hue. They watched, unblinking and silent, reflecting a light that didn't belong to the train or the moon. Michael's breath fogged the window as he pressed his palm against the cold glass, heart pounding. Whispers seemed to ripple through the air, impossible to localize, but impossible to ignore. Was the train's engine faltering, or was his mind unraveling in the suffocating darkness? Michael reached for the emergency brake handle, his fingers trembling. But the moment his hand touched the cold metal, the whispers crescendoed into a chorus of unintelligible voices. The train jolted violently, lights flickering out before plunging the carriage into near darkness. The only illumination came from the eyes outside, hundreds of them, pulsating rhythmically, as if breathing with the forest itself. Panic surged, yet he could neither move nor speak, trapped in a liminal space between fear and disbelief. Suddenly, the lights snapped back on, and the train slowed to a stop at a small, forgotten station. The platform was empty, only drenched wooden benches and the distant howl of wind. Michael's heart still hammered as he peered out, expecting the eyes to vanish. Instead, they remained, fixed on him from the edge of the forest. He stepped off the train, every nerve alive with dread. The station sign read simply, Crimson Hill. No town, no lights, just silence and watching eyes. The line between reality and nightmare had blurred, and Michael realized some journeys end not with arrival, but with awakening to something far older, far darker. Voices in the attic at 3 a.m. It was exactly 3 a.m. when the first whisper came. Lena had just settled into bed in the creaky old house she'd inherited from a distant relative, the kind of place where the walls seemed to hold their own stories. At first, she thought it was the wind, or maybe the settling of the old timber framing. But the voice was too soft, too deliberate, a faint murmur that seemed to drift from the attic directly above her bedroom ceiling. She held her breath, straining to catch the words, but all she could hear was an indistinct, chilling sigh that settled deep into the silence. The nights that followed were no different. Each night, just as the clock struck 3, the whispers returned, growing slightly louder and more persistent. Sometimes they sounded like faint footsteps pacing slowly above her, other times like soft sobbing, barely audible through the floorboards. Lena's curiosity battled with a growing unease. Was it the house playing tricks on her mind, or something else entirely? She began to keep a small recorder by her bed, hoping to capture the sounds and perhaps make sense of them by daylight. One morning, replaying the recordings, Lena's blood ran cold. Beneath the static and faint murmurs, a voice emerged clear and urgent, but fragmented. It spoke her name, whispered in a tone that was both sorrowful and pleading. She hadn't told anyone she was staying here, so how could the voice know? Questions spiraled in her mind, mixing with an inexplicable sense of familiarity. The attic wasn't just a dusty storage space. It was a threshold to something she couldn't yet understand, something tied to the house's past, and perhaps to her own forgotten history. Driven by a mix of fear and fascination, Lena decided to explore the attic during the day. She found old trunks filled with faded photographs, yellowed letters, and a leather-bound journal belonging to a woman named Elise, dated nearly a century ago. The entries spoke of loneliness, lost love, and the unbearable weight of secrets kept in silence. The last pages grew erratic, hinting at someone or something listening from the shadows. Lena's heart pounded as she realized the voice at 3 and might be Elise's, trapped in time, still trying to reach out. That night, Lena stayed awake, notebook in hand, ready to respond if the voice returned. As the clock struck 3, the room seemed to hold its breath. The whisper came again, this time clearer, almost conversational. It spoke of regret and a warning, urging Lena to uncover a truth buried long ago before it was too late. The attic light flickered, and for a brief moment, Lena glimpsed a translucent figure standing by the rafters, Elise, or whatever lingered in her stead. The presence was neither hostile nor kind, just profoundly sad, as if waiting for release that might never come. In the days that followed, Lena became obsessed with piecing together Elise's story. Yet the more she uncovered, the more the line between past and present blurred. The whispers grew urgent and sometimes desperate, as if the attic itself was alive, watching her every move. Sleep became elusive, and the house's shadows lengthened into shapes that toyed with her mind. Was the presence a benevolent spirit seeking justice, or something darker, feeding on her growing fear? Lena knew one thing for certain: some voices should remain silent, but hers was not yet ready to stop listening. On her last night before leaving the house, Lena recorded one final message into the empty attic. She whispered back to the voice, offering words of understanding and a promise to remember. As the clock struck 3 a.m., the whispers softened into a peaceful sigh, and silence settled like a gentle blanket. The attic felt lighter somehow, as if a long-held breath had finally been released. Yet, as dawn's first light crept through the window, Lena couldn't shake the feeling that some stories echo forever, waiting patiently for the next listener brave enough to hear them. The lights went out in Silent Pines, with no exit. Silent Pines was never known for its liveliness, but the blackout that fell one winter evening plunged the town into an unsettling abyss. One moment, the pale glow of street lamps and cozy windows painted the streets. The next, everything was swallowed by a thick, unnatural darkness. Phones lost signal, generators failed, and even the stars seemed to vanish behind an impenetrable shroud. people peered anxiously into the void, wondering if this was a simple power failure or something far more sinister. Mara, a young schoolteacher, was among those caught in the blackout. She had been preparing lesson plans by the flicker of a candle when the light died completely. Her phone was useless, and the silence outside felt oppressive, as if the world itself was holding its breath. When she stepped outside, the cold air was thick, and the usual comforting creaks of the town were replaced by an uncanny stillness. Something about the darkness felt alive, watching, waiting. The hours drifted by, with no sign of power returning. Mara's neighbors gathered, their faces pale in the weak glow of flashlights and lanterns. Whispers began to spread, strange sounds heard at the edge of town, fleeting shadows slipping between trees, and the unsettling feeling that no one could leave, as if the roads themselves had vanished. Attempts to drive out were met with impassable darkness, where familiar landmarks twisted into unrecognizable shapes. Mara decided to investigate alone. With only her flashlight, she ventured toward the edge of the forest, where the whispers seemed loudest. The beam cut through the blackness, revealing gnarled branches that appeared to twitch and shift. Every step forward felt heavier, as though the earth beneath her was reluctant to let her pass. She heard her name whispered on the wind, soft but unmistakable, though no one was there. Deep within the woods, Mara stumbled upon an abandoned cabin, its windows dark, but dripping with a faint, unnatural glow beneath the cracks. Inside, the air was thick with cold and silence. On the floor, she found a circle of faded photographs, pictures of the town, its residents, and herself, dated years into the future. Panic rose as she realized the images were not just memories, but warnings. The lights in Silent Pines were not meant to return, not until a choice was made. Mara fled the cabin, the weight of unseen eyes heavy on her back. Returning to the town, the darkness remained unbroken, and whispers turned to murmurs of surrender. Some neighbors vanished, leaving behind only their hollowed homes. Mara understood then that Silent Pines was caught in a liminal space, a trap between reality and something else entirely. The lights had gone out not by accident, but as a barrier, holding them in place until the town chose whether to stay forever in the dark or step into the unknown beyond. Standing under the thick black sky, Mara faced the impossible: to remain with the fading echoes of her past life in Silent Pines' endless night, or to cross the blurred boundary into a realm unknown, where light and darkness merged into a silence that promised freedom or oblivion. As the first faint glimmers of dawn teased the horizon, the town waited, breathless and still, for the choice that would never fully be revealed. The mirror in Black Hollow. Emma never expected to inherit anything from her late grandmother, especially not the crumbling farmhouse in a place locals whispered about as Black Hollow. Arriving at the property just as dusk settled, she felt the chill of the thick woods pressing close, as if the trees themselves were watching. The house groaned softly in the breeze, its weathered boards and shuttered windows casting long shadows. Inside, the air smelled of dust and forgotten memories, and Emma's footsteps echoed hollowly as she explored, drawn inexplicably toward the attic. In the attic's deepest corner, Emma's fingers brushed against something cold and smooth, an antique mirror with an ornate, blackened silver frame. The glass was oddly pristine despite the dust around it, and as she wiped the surface, a strange shiver ran down her spine. The mirror seemed to pulse faintly, as if breathing. When Emma looked into it, the reflection was almost right. But then the shadows behind her shifted unnaturally, and a fleeting glimpse of a figure with hollow eyes flickered in the glass. Emma took the mirror downstairs, hoping to study it in better light. But as days passed, the reflections began to warp more disturbingly. At times, the mirror showed rooms she didn't recognize, dark hallways stretching into blackness, impossible angles, and glimpses of figures standing just beyond her sight. She started to doubt what was real, noticing subtle changes in her home when not looking directly. Objects moved, whispers echoed in empty rooms, and the air grew colder near the mirror. Sleep became restless, haunted by dreams where she was trapped behind the glass, watching herself from the other side. Determined to understand the mirror's secret, Emma researched Black Hollow's history. She uncovered old tales of a vanished family, rumored to have been swallowed by the mirror's curse, trapped between worlds, their fates forever unknown. Locals avoided the farmhouse, speaking of a presence that lingered, watching. Emma's connection to the mirror deepened, and she felt a sinister weight pressing on her mind, a pull she couldn't resist. One night, drawn by a whisper only she could hear, she approached the mirror again, heart pounding, as the surface began to ripple like dark water. The next morning, Emma was gone. The mirror stood silent and still, reflecting only the empty room. Neighbors who dared peer inside reported a strange chill and whispered seeing a woman's silhouette flicker within the glass. Black Hollow's whispers grew louder, the story of the mirror's new victim joining the eerie legends that kept the village shrouded in fear. The mirror remains in the farmhouse, waiting patiently, a gateway between what is seen and what is hidden, where reflections can vanish and reality blurs into darkness. The fog that sees everything. Leela stepped off the bus just as the sun dipped below the horizon, the familiar scent of salt and damp earth greeting her like a forgotten lullaby. The town she had left behind years ago was swallowed whole by a thick, unnatural fog that crept along the cobblestone streets and twisted alleys. It wasn't just any mist. This fog held a strange stillness, as if it listened, watched, and waited. The streetlights flickered weakly, their glow struggling to pierce the gray veil that seemed to suck the warmth from the air. Leela felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the cold. Something about this fog was different, alive, almost. As she walked toward her childhood home, the fog seemed to thicken, wrapping around her like a living shroud. Shapes flickered at the edge of her vision, dark forms that vanished whenever she tried to focus. Her breath came in quiet puffs, mingling with whispers that seemed to come from the fog itself. But when she stopped to listen, all she could hear was the soft rustle of the wind through bare branches. The house looked the same, yet something was off. The windows reflected more than her own image. Shadows lingered behind the glass, and the familiar creak of the porch floorboards felt like a warning. Inside, the air was colder than outside, and the silence pressed against her ears. The fog seemed to seep through the cracks in the walls, curling around furniture and lingering in the corners. As she moved through the rooms, fleeting images flashed, her own memories twisted and interwoven with scenes she couldn't place. A child's laughter that wasn't hers, a figure standing silently by a window, watching. These visions vanished whenever she blinked, leaving only a gnawing sense of being observed, as if the fog itself remembered things long buried under layers of time and grief. At night, the whispers grew louder, no longer distant, but right beside her. They spoke without words, filling her mind with fragmented thoughts and emotions she couldn't explain: fear, sorrow, longing. She realized the fog wasn't just a natural phenomenon. It was a presence that saw everything, remembered everything. It held the echoes of the town's past, the secrets buried in its soil, and the guilt carried silently by those who had left and those who remained. Leela felt the weight of those memories pressing down on her, twisting her thoughts until she wasn't sure where she ended and the fog began. In the early hours, she found herself standing outside again, drawn inexplicably to the shoreline where the fog met the restless sea. The water was dark and silent, reflecting the swirling mist like a mirror to another world. There, in that boundary between land and water, the fog revealed a truth she had not dared to face. It was not just a watcher, but a keeper of stories, and she was now part of its story. As the first light of dawn filtered through the haze, Leela understood that some mysteries never fully clear, and some fears remain because they must, lingering like the fog that sees everything. Echoes beneath the floorboards. When Emma first stepped into the old countryside house, she felt a peculiar chill, not from the cold, but from the weight of silence that seemed to settle like dust in every corner. The wooden floorboards creaked underfoot, each groan echoing through the empty rooms. At night, when the world outside faded to a hush, faint whispers began threading through the darkness, seeming to come from beneath the very floor she walked on. At first, she thought it was the wind playing tricks, but the voices were too deliberate, too close. Days passed, and the faint murmurs grew into tentative phrases, fragments of conversation that teased her imagination. Words like forgotten, beneath, and help me slipped through the cracks between floorboards. Emma found herself drawn to the floor, pressing her ear against the cold wood, heart pounding, with a mix of fear and fascination. The house no longer felt empty. It was alive with something unseen, something trapped in the shadows beneath her feet, begging for attention. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills, Emma discovered a loose floorboard near the fireplace. With trembling hands, she pried it open to reveal a narrow, dark cavity beneath. Inside lay a faded, leather-bound journal, its pages brittle with age. The entries spoke of a man who once lived there, a recluse tormented by voices only he could hear, voices that drove him to isolation and despair. Emma's breath hitched. The whispers she heard seemed to echo the anguish inked on those pages, blurring the line between past and present. As nights deepened, the voices grew clearer, no longer whispers, but soft pleas layered with sorrow and regret. Emma began to question her own sanity. Were these echoes merely memories trapped in decay? Or was something still alive beneath the floorboards, reaching out through time? Her dreams became restless, filled with shadowy figures and muffled cries, blurring the boundary between waking and sleep. The house seemed to pulse with a life of its own, a silent witness to secrets better left buried. One morning, driven by a mix of dread and determination, Emma descended into the shadowed crawlspace beneath the house. Her flashlight pierced the darkness, revealing peeling wallpaper and forgotten relics of a life long gone. The air was thick with dust and something else, an unspoken sorrow that clung to the walls. As she explored, a chill brushed her skin, and the whispers coalesced into a single, chilling sentence. "Set us free." Emma's heart thundered as she realized the voices were not just memories, but trapped souls bound by a tragic past, waiting for release. The days that followed brought no easy answers, only more questions and a growing unease that settled into Emma's bones. She tried to leave, but the house seemed to resist, a creak here, a whisper there, as if reminding her it was not done with her yet. In the quiet moments between dusk and dawn, Emma found herself listening intently to the floorboards, caught in a delicate dance between fear and empathy. The echoes beneath the floor were no longer just sounds. They were voices tethered to a sorrow she could neither ignore nor fully understand. One night, as a storm raged outside, the whispers crescendoed into a mournful chorus that filled the entire house. Emma felt a presence brush past her, cold and fleeting, like a breath from another world. Then silence, thick, heavy, and absolute. The next morning, the loose floorboard was sealed tight, the journal gone as if never found. Yet, whenever Emma walked across the floor, a faint echo of voices seemed to follow, a lingering reminder that some stories never truly end, and some echoes beneath the floorboards never fade away. Alone in Wicker Street, and it was watching. Ellie had never expected to find peace in a place like Wicker Street. The narrow lane snaked quietly through the old part of town, where the houses leaned close together, their brick facades mottled by years of rain and time. She moved in just as the sun dipped beneath the horizon, the fading light casting long fingers of shadow that tangled with the creeping mist. The air was cool, sharp with the scent of damp leaves and wood smoke, but the silence was what unsettled her most. It wasn't the kind of silence that promised rest. It felt watchful, like the street itself was holding its breath, waiting. The townhouse she rented was an old thing, all creaks and sighs, with narrow windows that seemed too small for the grand rooms inside. As night deepened, Ellie sat by the window, the glow of a single lamp barely pushing back the darkness. Outside, the street was empty, but something about the way the shadows shifted beyond the glass made her glance over her shoulder more than once. It was as if there was a presence just beyond sight, something patient, waiting silently to be noticed. She told herself it was just nerves, the aftermath of her recent loneliness, but the uneasy feeling clung to her skin like a chill. On the third night, the noises began. At first, subtle, soft tapping at the window, like a fingernail tracing the glass. Ellie froze, heart hammering, convinced it was a branch or a stray animal. Yet each time she looked, nothing stirred. Then came the faintest whisper of footsteps on the sidewalk, slow and deliberate, stopping just below her window before fading into silence. She dared not open the curtains, afraid to confirm what she dreaded, that someone or something was out there, watching her. Sleep became a fragile, elusive thing, her dreams haunted by eyes glowing faintly in the dark. Days blended into nights, each moment thick with a growing dread. Ellie noticed the feeling of being watched even in broad daylight, glances from passing neighbors that seemed too quick, too knowing. Her phone flickered with static when she tried to call for help, and lights in the house dimmed unpredictably. Most unsettling were the small, impossible changes. Furniture subtly shifted, objects misplaced, as if someone had moved through the rooms in her absence. She began leaving notes for herself, reminders that she was alone, but the answers she sought never came. The silence around her grew heavier, as if the house itself was closing in, breathing with a slow, rhythmic pulse. One night, driven by a mix of fear and defiance, Ellie opened the front door to confront whatever was lurking beyond. The street was empty, bathed in cold moonlight, but the sensation of unseen eyes pressed in like a weight on her chest. She stepped out, heart pounding, scanning the darkness. Then, from the corner of her eye, she caught a glimpse, a fleeting shadow slipping between the trees lining the street. "Frozen," she called out, but only the distant rustle of leaves answered. The watcher was there, always just out of reach, a silent guardian or a merciless observer. Ellie could no longer tell. The house behind her seemed to sigh, the door closing softly, sealing her back inside with the secret that would never fully reveal itself. In the days that followed, Ellie found herself trapped in a liminal space between reality and fear, unsure if the watcher was a figment of her unraveling mind or something far more real. The town's quiet facade masked a history she was only beginning to understand, stories whispered about disappearances, and silent witnesses who never left their posts. Whether the watcher was protector or predator remained a mystery, but Ellie knew one thing: Wicker Street was alive, and it had chosen her as its next secret. As she sat by the window once more, eyes fixed on the empty street, she realized that some silences were meant to be broken, and others to be forever watched. Beneath the cornfield, and the clock stopped. From the moment Eliza stepped onto the creaking porch of her grandmother's farmhouse, an uneasy stillness settled over her. The summer air was heavy, the kind that presses against your skin and muffles sound. Beyond the weathered wooden rails, the cornfield stretched endlessly, golden stalks swaying in a wind she couldn't feel. She glanced up at the sky, expecting clouds or stars, but the air hung thick and silent, as if time itself had paused in a breathless moment. Something about this place whispered secrets she wasn't ready to hear. At night, the silence deepened. Eliza lay awake in her grandmother's old bed, the moonlight slipping through the cracked window. She could hear faint rustling beneath the door, almost like whispers carried by the corn. Gathering her courage, she pulled on a coat and stepped outside. The field's edge was darker than she expected, the stalks taller, their shadows twisting like fingers reaching for her. And then she noticed it, the old clock hanging on the barn's exterior, its hands frozen at midnight. The clock hadn't worked for years, yet tonight it seemed to pulse with a strange energy. Drawn by a force she couldn't explain, Eliza ventured deeper between the towering stalks. The whispers grew louder, a chorus of half-words and half-memories brushing past her ears. The ground beneath her feet felt soft, almost like it was breathing. Suddenly, she stumbled into a small clearing where the corn gave way to a patch of bare earth, cracked and dry. In the center lay an old, rusted pocket watch, its face shattered, but frozen at the same midnight hour as the barn clock. A chill ran down her spine as she realized the clocks weren't just broken. They were markers of something lost, something buried beneath the soil. Memories she hadn't known she possessed began to surface, fragments of her grandmother's stories, warnings about the field and the time that stopped here. It was said the cornfield was a kind of living clock, a place where moments could stretch or snap, where the past and present tangled like the roots underground. Eliza's heart pounded as the whispers turned into voices, soft but insistent. They spoke of a promise, a betrayal, and a cycle that must not be broken. Yet the more she listened, the more she questioned her own mind. Was this real, or a trick woven by loneliness and grief? Determined to find answers, Eliza returned to the house and searched through her grandmother's belongings. In a dusty trunk, she found a diary filled with fragmented entries, notes about time slipping, about the cornfield's strange power, and a warning never to follow the shadows beneath the stalks. One passage chilled her. When the clock stops, the field takes what it needs. We live between seconds, and sometimes we don't come back. Outside, the wind began to stir for the first time in days, rattling the window panes like a trembling heartbeat. At night, the clock's hands suddenly twitched, inching forward as the cornfield seemed to sigh. Eliza felt the ground pulse beneath her, and the whispers rise into a haunting melody. With every step she took back toward the field's edge, the air thickened, and shapes flickered just beyond sight. The boundary between the living and the forgotten blurred. She realized the field was not just a place, but a trap, a place that held the lost moments of those who had vanished, suspended in time beneath the waving stalks. And now it was calling her to join them. Eliza paused, breath caught between fear and fascination. The wind carried a voice, barely audible but unmistakable, her grandmother's voice, urging her to break the cycle or be lost forever beneath the endless corn. With trembling hands, she reached for the broken pocket watch in her pocket, a piece of the past she could no longer ignore. The clock hands froze once more. The field fell silent, and Eliza understood that some moments, once stopped, might never start again. She stepped back toward the safety of the house, the whispers fading, but never quite leaving their secret lingering beneath the cornfield and the silent, stopped clock.